In the city's rush, an invisible elderly woman fights against hunger, cold, and abandonment. Rejected by her wealthy son, she finds strength in the simple gesture of a stranger. Her pain becomes a bridge, her story echoes, and the world finally learns to see her courage. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. New York City was waking up the way it always did, in a hurry, with a roar, with millions of people rushing in opposite directions, each chasing their own dreams, their own battles. In the midst of so many people, Margaret Miller walked slowly along the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, as invisible as a ghost in broad daylight. No one looked at her. No one saw the 68-year-old woman with disheveled grey hair and worn-out clothes that no longer remembered their original color. She was just another shadow in the crowd, another body taking up space but drawing no attention. It was hard to believe that this woman, now bent by the weight of life, had once been the pillar of an entire family. Margaret carried within her a story that few knew, a journey of sacrifices that had begun so many years ago that sometimes she herself had trouble remembering when everything was different. But the memories would come, especially on cold nights when her body ached and her heart ached even more. She had been married to John Miller, a simple, hard-working man who made a living as a mechanic in a garage in Queens. John was one of those men who smiled even when life got tough, who came home covered in grease but with a clean heart, always bringing something for his son, even if it was just a lollipop bought from the corner store. Ryan, the boy born when Margaret was only 22, was the joy of that humble family living in a small back room of a house in Astoria. Time passed too quickly. Margaret worked as a housekeeper, cleaning the homes of wealthy women on the Upper East Side, waking up before sunrise to catch 2 buses to work. John left early too, and came back late, but they always found a way to have dinner together, the 3 of them, at that tiny table that barely fit in the room. That served as both kitchen and living room. Ryan grew up smart, got good grades in public school, and dreamed of being someone important, someone who could give his parents a better life. But life has its own plans, and they don't always align with ours. John started feeling tired, a fatigue that didn't go away even with rest. Margaret insisted he see a doctor, but he said it was just overwork, that it would pass soon. When he finally went to the community clinic, it was too late. His heart was tired, his arteries were clogged, and one night, while sleeping beside Margaret, John simply passed away. There was no goodbye, no last conversation, no chance to say everything that needed to be said. Margaret was 37 when she found herself alone with a 15-year-old son. The world came crashing down on her shoulders that morning when she woke up and realized John wasn't breathing anymore. The scream she let out echoed through the entire neighborhood, a cry of pain that came from a place too deep to be comforted. But she didn't have much time to surrender to grief. Ryan needed her, and she needed to be strong. The following years were a succession of jobs, bills, and worries. Margaret took on more work, cleaning 5 houses during the week, sometimes even on Saturdays. Her hands became calloused from so much scrubbing, her back ached from carrying buckets and mopping floors. But she didn't complain. She saw Ryan studying at the kitchen table, saw the boy growing up, turning into a determined young man, and that was enough fuel to keep going. Ryan was intelligent. He got a full scholarship to a private university, majored in business administration, and graduated at the top of his class. Margaret cried, with pride on graduation day, seeing her son in his cap and gown, diploma in hand. It had all been worth it. All those mornings waking up in the dark, all those days she went to work even when she was sick, it all made sense in that moment. Ryan's first job was at a small company, but he was quickly noticed. He was dedicated, ambitious, and a good communicator. Within a few years he was at a bigger company, then an even bigger one. At 32, Ryan was a manager at a multinational corporation, earning a great salary, driving a new car, and living in an apartment in Park Slope. Margaret remained in Astoria in the same small back room, but now she owned the house, having bought the property with the savings from years of work. Ryan would visit his mother on Sundays, bring groceries and leave cash hidden in a kitchen drawer because he knew she wouldn't accept it outright. They would have lunch together, talk about life, about his work, about her employers. Margaret felt she was losing her son little by little, that he was entering a different world, a world where she didn't fit in. But she was still happy for his success. After all, wasn't that what she had always wanted? To see her son doing well, fulfilled, and happy. Everything started to change when Ryan met Patricia Vanderbilt. She was a lawyer, the daughter of entrepreneurs, lived in a penthouse apartment in Soho, had studied abroad and spoke 3 languages. She was beautiful, elegant, and self-assured. Ryan fell in love quickly, and Margaret noticed it the first time he mentioned her name. There was a different sparkle in her son's eyes, an excitement she hadn't seen in a long time. The first meeting between Margaret and Patricia took place at Ryan's apartment. He had invited his mother for a special lunch, saying he had someone important to introduce. Margaret dressed up, choosing the dress she wore for special occasions, put her hair up, and applied a touch of lipstick. She wanted to make a good impression on the woman who had stolen her son's heart, but the impression Patricia had of her was different from what Margaret expected. She noticed it in the first few minutes, in the way Patricia looked at her calloused hands, her simple dress, her flat shoes. There was a distance in that gaze, a polite coldness that hurt more than a direct insult. Patricia smiled, greeted her, and asked polite questions about Margaret's life, but it all seemed automatic, rehearsed, devoid of genuine warmth. During lunch, Margaret tried to be friendly, telling stories about when Ryan was a child, trying to show this young woman what a wonderful man her son was. But Patricia seemed more interested in her phone than in the stories, responding with monosyllables and averting her gaze. Ryan didn't notice or pretended not to. He was so enchanted, so happy, that he didn't see his mother's discomfort, the tension in the air. When Margaret left that afternoon, she knew something had changed. Ryan walked her to the elevator, gave her a hurried kiss on the forehead, and said he'd call during the week. But the call never came. Not the next week, not the one after that. Margaret tried calling a few times, but Ryan was always busy, always had a meeting, always promised to call back, and never did. Months passed, and the Sunday visits started to dwindle. First, Ryan said he had too much work, that weekends were for resting. Then he started showing up with Patricia, but the visits were quick, formal, without the intimacy of before. Patricia would stay in the living room scrolling on her phone while Ryan talked to his mother in the kitchen. It was as if she were there just to make an appearance, to fulfill a social obligation. Margaret tried to be understanding. She told herself it was natural, that her son was building his own family, that she needed to accept this new phase. But deep down, it hurt. It hurt to see the distance, to feel the coldness, to realize she was being left behind. She kept working, cleaning houses, saving her little bit of money, living her simple life, but now with an emptiness that hadn't been there before. When Ryan announced his engagement, Margaret heard the news over the phone. He didn't come to her house, didn't bring Patricia to share the news in person. He simply called in a rush between meetings and said he was engaged, that the wedding would be in 6 months, and that she would receive the invitation in the mail. Margaret stopped breathing for a moment. Her son was getting married, and she was finding out over the phone, like a distant acquaintance, not like the mother who had given her life for him. The wedding was at a lavish venue on the south shore of Long Island. Margaret received the formal invitation with gold lettering on glossy paper. She bought a new dress with the money she had been saving to fix the roof of her small house. On the day of the ceremony, she arrived early, nervous, trying not to feel out of place amidst so many elegant people, so much wealth, so much luxury. Ryan greeted her quickly, a swift kiss on the cheek, a rushed smile, and returned to his important guests. During the reception, Margaret sat at a table in the back, near the kitchen, with some distant cousins she barely knew. She watched her son dance with his bride, listened to the emotional speeches, saw the photos being taken, but she wasn't called for any of them. It was as if she wasn't part of the celebration, as if she were just an extra in someone else's story. When she left, before the cake was even cut, no one noticed her departure. The following years were filled with a growing silence. Ryan would call once in a while, always in a hurry. The visits stopped completely. Margaret heard from neighbours that he had moved to a huge house in Scarsdale, that he was doing very well in his career, that Patricia had opened a luxury law firm. She was happy for her son's achievements, but the joy was mixed with a deep sadness, a sense of abandonment she couldn't ignore. It was on a rainy afternoon in May, when Margaret was 65, that everything fell apart for good. She was at one of her employer's houses ironing clothes when she felt a sharp headache, a sudden dizziness. She tried to lean on the ironing board, but her legs wouldn't obey. The world spun, colours blurred, and Margaret collapsed on the laundry room floor, unconscious. She woke up in a public hospital 3 days later. The doctor explained that she had suffered a stroke, an ischemic stroke that had affected the right side of her body. She survived, but was left with after effects. Her right arm no longer had the same strength. Her leg dragged a little when she walked, and her speech was slightly slurred. The doctor said that, with physical therapy, she could improve, but Margaret knew that physical therapy was expensive, and she had no health insurance, no way to pay for it. The employer at whose house she had collapsed let her go soon after, saying she needed someone younger, more agile. The other employers did the same, one by one, always with the same excuse, always with the same coldness. In 2 months, Margaret lost all her jobs. Her social security check was barely enough to pay for electricity, water and gas. The money she had saved was quickly spent on medication, food and overdue bills. It was then that the owner of the house where she lived appeared with devastating news. He had sold the property to a developer who was going to demolish everything to build a condominium. Margaret would have to leave. She explained that she had bought that back house, that she had documents, but when she looked for the papers, she discovered she had never officially registered the purchase. It was all informal, a verbal agreement that was now worthless. The new owner gave her 1 month to vacate. Margaret called Ryan. The phone rang several times before he answered. When he did, he was clearly annoyed, busy. She explained the situation, her voice trembling, the words coming out with difficulty because of the stroke's after effects. Ryan sighed on the other end of the line. That sigh she knew so well, that sigh of impatience, of annoyance. He said he couldn't help that things were complicated, that Patricia wouldn't accept his mother living with them, that there was no space, that he couldn't afford it. He said she should look for a shelter, that there were public places for people in her situation, that he couldn't do anything. Margaret felt the world collapse once more. Her son, the boy she had raised alone, the man she had given her entire life for, was telling her to find a shelter. She tried to argue, tried to remind him of the sacrifices she had made, but Ryan was already ending the call. He said he had to go, that he had an important meeting, that they would talk calmly later. But later never came. Ryan stopped answering her calls. He changed his cell phone number without telling her. On the day the developer's truck arrived to demolish the house, Margaret was sitting on the sidewalk next to 2 old bags containing everything that was left of her life. Clothes, some papers, a wedding photo with John, a photo of Ryan as a child. She watched the house being torn down, watched the rubble being carried away, watched her past turn to dust. And when there was nothing left to see, she stood up, picked up her bags, and began to walk the streets of New York, with no destination, no direction, no hope. The first few days were a state of shock, of denial. Margaret walked the streets like a zombie, trying to process what was happening. How had she gotten here? How had life taken such a turn? She slept in a park the first night, waking up with an aching body, cold and afraid. She tried to wash her face at a public water fountain, but the water was freezing, and she couldn't use much force with her right arm. A man passing through the park told her there was a city shelter a few blocks away. Margaret thanked him and headed in the direction he pointed, dragging her bags, dragging her feet, dragging the hope that stubbornly refused to die completely. She arrived at the shelter in the middle of the afternoon. There was a huge line at the door, dozens of people waiting for a bed that might not exist. Margaret waited for hours. When it was finally her turn, the social worker was clear and direct. There were no beds. The shelter was overcrowded. She could try another one in Queens or another one in the Bronx. Margaret thanked her and left, more tired than when she had arrived. She tried the shelter in Queens the next day. Same story, she tried the one in the Bronx. 2 days later, same answer. It was then that Margaret understood she was truly alone. There was no safety net, no system that worked, no son who cared. She was just another number in the statistics of a city that produces invisible people every day. And that's how Margaret Miller, the woman who once had a family, a job, a life, became just another homeless person on the sidewalks of New York. The weeks dragged on with a cruelty Margaret had never imagined existed. Every day was a fight for survival, every night a challenge against the cold, the fear, the despair. She learned to look for cardboard in the trash bins behind stores, to make small shelters under awnings, to sleep with one eye open because the streets weren't safe, especially for a lone, frail woman. Hunger was a constant companion. Margaret began to look for food wherever she could. Sometimes a charitable soul would offer a plate of food at a soup kitchen. Other times she would rummage through trash cans for something still edible, something not completely spoiled. The dignity she had always carried, that upright posture, that quiet pride, was eroded day by day, replaced by a humiliation that hurt more than any physical pain. But the hunger in her stomach was small, very small, compared to the hunger for dignity. Margaret missed being seen as a human being treated with a minimum of respect. People passed her by as if she didn't exist, averted their eyes when she asked for help, crossed the street when they saw her sitting on the sidewalk. It was as if she had ceased to be a person, as if she had become part of the urban landscape, a problem no one wanted to see. She thought about Ryan every day. She wondered what he was doing, if he ever thought of her, if he felt any remorse. She imagined his life in the big house in Scarsdale, the dinners with important friends, the weekend trips, the imported cars in the garage. And while she imagined, she was there, sitting on the curb with dirty clothes, an aching body and a broken heart. There were moments when Margaret thought about giving up, nights when the cold was so intense that she wondered if it was worth continuing. Mornings when she woke up so tired, so weak that she would sit for hours, staring into space with no will to get up. But something inside her, something stubborn, something that came from the very core of who she was, wouldn't let her surrender completely. Maybe it was the memory of John, her husband, who always said she was the strongest woman he knew. Maybe it was the pride of having raised a son, even if that son had abandoned her. Maybe it was simply the survival instinct, that primitive force that keeps us alive, even when everything conspires against us. Margaret wasn't sure. She only knew she had to. Keep going, one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, 1 minute at a time. And it was with this fragile but still present determination that she continued through the streets of New York, invisible to the eyes of most, but still there, still breathing, still existing, still being Margaret Miller, the woman who was once a mother, a wife, a worker, and who was now just another shadow in the crowd of a city that doesn't stop to look back. The mornings were always the worst. Waking up on the hard ground, her whole body aching, was a cruel reminder of how her life had changed. Margaret remembered the days when she would wake up in her simple but comfortable bed, when her biggest problem was deciding which house to clean first. Now, the problem was finding a public restroom where she could clean herself minimally, something that became increasingly difficult with her mobility reduced by the stroke. She developed a survival routine. She would wake up early, before the street traffic picked up, to avoid the looks of pity or disgust. She would pack her belongings in the 2 old bags, tying everything carefully so nothing would fall out, and start walking. She had a few fixed spots she visited every day, a church in Lower Manhattan that opened its doors for those who needed to use the restroom, a soup kitchen in the village where she could get a plate of food at noon if she arrived early, a park in Chinatown where she could rest under a tree without being bothered by security guards. But the city is cruel to those without money. Margaret discovered this in the worst possible way. Once, she tried to enter a mall to use the restroom and was stopped by a security guard. He looked at her dirty clothes, her tied-up bags, and simply said she couldn't come in. There was no explanation, no politeness, just the physical barrier of a uniformed man representing a system that had no room for people like her. Margaret felt the humiliation burn in her chest, but she didn't argue. She knew it would be pointless. She turned her back and kept walking, looking for another place, another restroom, another solution. With each rejection, a piece of her died. It wasn't just her body that was being destroyed by life on the streets. It was also her soul, her identity, her sense of belonging anywhere. There were days when the rain fell relentlessly and Margaret couldn't find adequate shelter. She would get soaked to the bone, shivering from the cold, feeling the icy water seep into her clothes, her skin, her bones. In those moments, she remembered the warm little room in the back of the house in Astoria, the feeling of being home, protected, safe. The longing was a hole in her chest that grew larger every day. But perhaps the worst of all was the invisibility. Margaret learned that to most people, she simply didn't exist. It was as if she had become transparent. People would walk past her, talking on their phones, laughing with friends, complaining about problems that seemed like luxuries to her. How many times had she heard someone complain about the traffic, the price of parking, the wait at a restaurant? And there she was, with nowhere to park because she had no car, who didn't go to restaurants because she had no money, who didn't complain about traffic because she walked everywhere carrying everything she owned in the world in 2 old bags. A very few, still looked at her with humanity. A man who sold pretzels on a corner of Fifth Avenue would sometimes give her a leftover pretzel from the day. A young woman who worked at a bakery in the village, when her boss wasn't looking, would put a few rolls in a small bag and hand them to Margaret with a shy smile, as if she were doing something wrong, as if offering food to the hungry were a crime. Margaret treasured these gestures in her heart, like rare jewels, as proof that not all of humanity was lost. The nights were long and frightening. Margaret learned to choose her sleeping spots carefully. She avoided places that were too dark, too isolated, because she knew the dangers that lurked in the shadows. She preferred the awnings of stores on busy streets, where the streetlights stayed on all night, and there was some movement of people and cars. Even so, she always slept with one eye open, always alert, always ready to get up and run if necessary. There was one night Margaret would never forget when a group of young men passed by where she was sleeping and started, laughing, taking pictures, making jokes. One of them even threw water on her, waking her from a light, restless sleep. Margaret got up, startled, confused, wet, and the young men laughed even harder, as if it were the funniest entertainment in the world. They left afterward, leaving her there, trembling, crying softly, feeling a shame she couldn't name. It was in those moments that Margaret thought of Ryan most intensely. She wondered how a son she had loved so much, for whom she had sacrificed everything, could simply pretend she didn't exist. How could he sleep at night, knowing his mother was on the streets? How could he sit at the table with his family, eat a hearty meal, while she rummaged through trash cans looking for scraps? The incomprehension was almost unbearable. But Margaret also found herself doing the opposite, trying to understand, trying to justify. Maybe Ryan was going through difficulties she didn't know about. Maybe Patricia really wouldn't let him help. Maybe he was afraid of losing his marriage, his social standing, everything he had achieved. Margaret wanted to believe that, wanted to believe there was an explanation other than pure cruelty, pure selfishness, pure forgetfulness. The days piled up into weeks, and the weeks into months. Margaret lost track of time. She no longer knew what day it was, what month it was. The calendar didn't matter when every day was the same as the last. Wake up, find food, find water, find a place to rest, sleep in fear, wake up and start over. It was an endless cycle, without purpose, without any visible hope. But there was something inside her, something stubborn and resilient, that refused to give up completely. Maybe it was the memory of John, who always said she was too strong, to be defeated. Maybe it was life itself, that inexplicable impulse that keeps us breathing even when we see no reason to continue. Maybe it was simply because Margaret Miller didn't know how to quit, not even when everything around her screamed that it was time to stop. And so, between humiliations and small acts of kindness, between cold nights and hungry days, between memories of the past and uncertainties about the future, Margaret continued her journey through the streets of New York. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if there would be a different tomorrow, if there would be any change, if there would be any light at the end of that dark tunnel. But she kept walking one step at a time, because that's what she knew how to do. Keep going. Always keep going. The city around her buzzed with life, with movement, with opportunities. But for Margaret, it was just a grey, cold desert, where she was just another stone in the path, another obstacle that people walked around without looking. She had become what society feared most, and yet ignored the most, an invisible, disposable, forgotten person. And the worst part was knowing that there was a time, not so long ago, when she too was one of those hurried people who passed through the streets without looking around, without seeing the suffering of others, without imagining that one day she could be on the other side, asking for the compassion she had not offered before. But Margaret was learning in the hardest way possible that life can change in an instant, that the ground beneath our feet is much more fragile than we imagine, that we are all just a few wrong decisions, a few strokes of bad luck, a few betrayals away from finding ourselves in the same situation. And when that moment comes, when we fall, that's when we discover who we really are, what we're really made of, whether we have enough grit to get back up, or if we simply surrender to the weight of the world. Margaret still didn't know what her fate would be. She didn't know if she would be able to rise from this situation, or if she would be just another statistic, another number on the government spreadsheets about the homeless population. But she knew deep in her heart that no matter what happened, she would fight until her last breath, because that's what John would have done, because that's what she had taught Ryan, even if he had forgotten the lessons, because that's what made her Margaret Miller, the woman who once had everything, lost everything, but never lost the essence of who she was. And as the sun set over the giant city, painting the sky in shades of orange that contrasted with the grey of the concrete, Margaret prepared for another night on the streets, another battle against the cold and fear, another day survived in this urban hell that did not forgive the weak, the old, the abandoned. But she was there. She was still there. And for now, that would have to be enough. Hunger was a sensation Margaret knew well, but she had never experienced it so brutally, so persistently, so desperately. It had been almost 3 months living on the streets, and her body was beginning to show clear signs that it couldn't take much more. Her bones protruded under her loose skin. The clothes that were once just worn now hung on her like rags on a scarecrow. But what hurt the most wasn't her prominent ribs or the weakness in her legs. It was the constant humiliation of having to ask, of depending on the goodwill of others, of having to swallow her pride along with the crumbs she sometimes managed to get. That September morning, an unseasonable chill gripped New York. Margaret had slept poorly, waking up several times during the night because of the icy wind that cut like a razor through her thin clothes. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky a pale orange, she got up with difficulty, every muscle in her body protesting the movement. Her right arm, already compromised by the stroke, was even stiffer from the cold, and she had to make a huge effort just to bend her fingers. She packed her belongings in her bags with slow, painful movements, tying everything with the care of someone who knows it's all they have in the world. The photo of John and the photo of Ryan as a child were at the bottom of one of the bags, wrapped in a plastic bag, to protect them from moisture. Margaret hadn't looked at those photos in weeks, because whenever she did, she felt a pain in her chest that was hard to bear. It was easier to pretend they weren't there, that that past hadn't existed, that she had always been this woman on the streets, without a history, without a name, without a family. She began to walk down Broadway, dragging her feet, feeling the dizziness that came from lack of food. She hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. The soup kitchen where she usually had lunch was closed for renovations, and the other options she knew were too far away, requiring a walk she wasn't sure she could make. Thirst was also pressing, but at least she could get water from public fountains or by asking at some establishment. It was with food on her mind that Margaret stopped in front of a bakery on the corner of Bleecker Street. The smell of fresh bread wafted onto the sidewalk, that warm, comforting aroma that promised satiety, that spoke of normal mornings, of families gathered together, of a simple but dignified life. Margaret stood there for a few minutes, just taking in the smell, letting the olfactory memory transport her to better times, when she herself would buy warm bread for breakfast with John and Ryan. Hunger overcame fear. Margaret took a deep breath, straightened her clothes as best she could, tried to smooth her disheveled hair with her left hand, and entered the bakery. The contrast between the cold of the street and the warmth inside was immediate. The place was small but cozy, with a few formica tables where customers were having breakfast, a glass counter full of breads, cakes and pastries, and 2 employees behind the counter, a young woman in a uniform and an older man who seemed to be the manager. Margaret approached the counter with hesitant steps. Other customers looked at her, some with curiosity, others with visible discomfort. She felt their stares, felt the silent judgment, but kept walking until she reached the counter. The young woman looked at her with an indefinable expression, somewhere between pity and disgust. The manager frowned. With a trembling voice, both from emotion and the after-effects of the stroke that made her speech a bit slurred, Margaret said she was very hungry, that she hadn't eaten properly in days, and that if they could spare any leftover bread from the day before, she would be very grateful. The words came, out jumbled, humble, laden with a shame that burned inside her. Never in her life, even in the most difficult times, had Margaret had to beg for food like this, face to face, exposing her misery to strangers. The manager looked her up and down, his face hardening with each second. When he finally spoke, his voice was too loud, filled with unnecessary cruelty. He said this was a family bakery, a decent establishment, that they didn't give out handouts, that if she wanted food she should go to a shelter or a charity. He also said, and these words were seared into Margaret's memory like a branding iron, that people like her drove away customers, that she was ruining the atmosphere, that she should leave immediately. The other employees snickered. It wasn't a loud laugh, but that restrained, complicit chuckle that is even more humiliating, because it shows that the cruelty is shared, approved, celebrated. The young woman looked away, seeming a bit embarrassed but not brave enough to defend Margaret. A customer having coffee made a comment that Margaret couldn't quite hear, but it provoked more laughter. Margaret felt her legs go weak. The world began to spin around her. The colors blurred, the sounds became muffled. She tried to say something, maybe to apologize for bothering them, maybe to explain that she was someone's mother, that she had a story, that she was a person just like anyone else there. But the words wouldn't come out. They were stuck in her throat along with the sob she didn't want to let escape. Not there. Not in front of those people. The manager made a sharp gesture with his hand, as if shooing away a stray dog. Margaret turned and left as quickly as her weakened legs would allow. She managed to get to the sidewalk, a few feet away from the bakery, and then she couldn't hold it in anymore. She sat right there on the dirty sidewalk, rested her head on the bag she carried, and cried. She cried like she hadn't cried in a long time, with deep sobs that shook her entire body, with hot tears that streamed down her wrinkled face and fell onto the cold cement. People passed by around her. Some looked with pity, others with annoyance. Most simply didn't look at all. Margaret was beyond caring. The humiliation was total, absolute, devastating. She had hit rock bottom, had experienced what it was like to be treated like trash, like something disposable that dirties the landscape and needs to be removed. And the worst part was knowing that tomorrow would be the same, and the day after tomorrow too, that this was her reality now, that there was no escape, no exit door, no one coming to her rescue. She was so lost in her pain that she didn't notice when someone approached. She only felt it when a gentle hand touched her shoulder. Margaret lifted her head, startled, and saw an elderly woman, perhaps her own age, maybe a little older. The woman had white hair tied in a simple bun, wore a floral cotton dress, and worn-out flip-flops. Her face had those deep wrinkles of someone who had worked hard, who had suffered, who knew life from the hard side. But there was something in her eyes, a sweetness, a genuine compassion that made Margaret's heart ache even more. The woman said nothing at first. She just squatted down with difficulty beside Margaret, ignoring the discomfort in her own old joints, and stayed there, her hand on Margaret's shoulder, conveying a silent solidarity that was worth more than 1,000 words. After a few minutes, when Margaret's sobs had subsided a bit, the woman pulled a small plastic bag from the worn purse she carried. Inside the bag were 2 bread rolls, plain, with nothing inside but still warm. The woman held out the bag to Margaret and said in a hoarse but affectionate voice that she had bought these rolls at another bakery down the street, but she wanted Margaret to have them. She also said she didn't have much to offer, that she herself lived on little, on a social security check that barely covered rent and bills, but she couldn't see another woman hungry and do nothing. Margaret looked at the woman, then at the rolls, and the tears returned. But they were different tears now, not just of pain, but also of gratitude, of relief, of a complex emotion that mixed the sadness of her situation with the joy of knowing that kindness still existed in the world. She took the rolls with trembling hands, thanked her with a choked voice, tried to say she didn't need them, that the woman should keep the food for herself. But the woman shook her head, smiled a toothless but genuine smile, and said she had already had breakfast, that these rolls were extra, that she would be pleased if Margaret accepted. She also said, before getting up with the help of the cane she carried, that Margaret shouldn't give up, that bad days pass, that there is always hope as long as there is life. Simple words, clichés perhaps, but at that moment they sounded like the truest and most important thing Margaret had heard in months. The woman left, walking slowly down the sidewalk, disappearing into the crowd before Margaret could fully process her, before she could say everything she wanted to say. She sat there with the 2 rolls in her lap, looking at them as if they were precious treasures. And in a way they were, not for their material value, but for what they represented, proof that not all of humanity was lost, that there were still people capable of seeing beyond appearances, of extending a hand without expecting anything in return. Margaret ate one of the rolls right there, sitting on the sidewalk. Each bite was an explosion of flavor and relief. The bread was soft, a little sweet. Perfect. She chewed slowly, savoring it, feeling the food soothe some of the pain in her empty stomach. She saved the second roll for later, wrapped it carefully in the plastic bag, and placed it in her bag next to the family photos. She had to make this food last as long as possible, because she didn't know when she would have her next meal. But the gesture of that anonymous woman did more than satisfy her physical hunger. It saved something inside Margaret that was about to die, hope, even if it was. A fragile hope, as faint as a flickering flame, it was still hope. And at that moment it was all she had. The following days were a continuation of the cruel routine of the streets. Margaret kept walking through the city, looking for food where she could, sleeping where she could, surviving one day at a time. But something had changed. The memory of that generous woman accompanied her, serving as a reminder that the world was not made only of cruelty, that there were small acts of kindness that could make all the difference. It was about 2 weeks, after the bakery incident, that Margaret began to feel that something was wrong with her body, worse than usual, that is. She woke up one morning coughing, a dry, painful cough that tore at her chest. She ignored it at first, thinking it was just the cold, the dry weather, the city dust. But the cough worsened. It was accompanied by a fever, by chills that made her shiver even when the sun was high and strong. Margaret tried to continue her routine, but her body no longer obeyed. Her legs grew weak, her head spun, the world seemed blurry, as if covered by a thick fog. There was one day when she simply couldn't get up. She lay under the awning where she had spent the night, looking at the grey sky, feeling her body burn with fever, her throat scratch with every attempt to swallow, her lungs burn with every breath. The hours passed in a blur. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, having strange dreams where John was alive and calling her, where Ryan was a child again and asking to be held, where she was back in the warm little room in Astoria. When she woke up, reality was even harsher than before. She was alone, sick, with no one, nothing, no hope. It was during one of these moments of semi-consciousness that Margaret heard a voice. A female voice, young, concerned. She felt hands touching her forehead, felt the coolness of water moistening her parched lips. She tried to open her eyes, but the sunlight was too strong. It hurt. She heard the voice say something about a hospital, about help, about not worrying. The young woman who had found Margaret was named Julia Chen, and she was 26. She was a volunteer for a non-profit that worked with the homeless, offering basic medical care, referrals to shelters and social assistance. Julia was passing by that street during her weekly rounds when she saw Margaret lying under the awning, clearly sick, clearly in need of urgent help. Julia didn't think twice. She called the non-profits coordinator, explained the situation, and asked them to send the van they used for outreach. While she waited, she stayed by Margaret's side, holding her hand, talking to her even without knowing if she was listening, trying to offer some comfort, some security. When the van arrived, she helped, carefully placed Margaret in the back seat, collected her bags, and made sure nothing was left behind. Margaret only regained full consciousness a few hours later, when she was already at the community clinic associated with the non-profit. It was a small but clean space, with a few beds, basic equipment, a nurse and a doctor who donated their time and knowledge to help those most in need. Margaret was lying on one of the beds, covered by a thin but clean blanket, with a thermometer in her mouth and an IV drip in her arm. When her eyes finally focused and she could process where she was, the first thing she saw was Julia's face, smiling at her with evident relief. The young woman explained what had happened, said that Margaret had pneumonia, that she needed treatment, and that she would stay there until she got better. She also said that she didn't need to be afraid, that they wouldn't send her away, that she would be cared for there. Margaret tried to speak, to thank her, but her throat was too dry. Her voice wouldn't come out right. Julia understood, brought a glass of water and helped her. Drink slowly, in small sips. The cool liquid going down her throat was an almost divine sensation after so long drinking from public fountains, sometimes from questionable public taps. In the following weeks, Margaret stayed at the clinic receiving treatment. She took antibiotics, had nebulizer treatments, and ate nutritious meals 3 times a day. The doctor, a middle-aged man named Dr. Peterson, examined her every day, adjusted her medication, and talked to her about how she was feeling. There was no rush to send her away, no pressure to free up the bed. There, for the first time in months, Margaret was treated like a human being, with dignity, with respect, with compassion. Julia visited every day. Sometimes she would stay for just a few minutes. Other times, she would spend hours talking with Margaret. It was during these conversations that Margaret's full story came to light. She told her about John, about Ryan, about the years of hard work, about the stroke, the abandonment, the streets. Julia listened without interrupting, without judging, just absorbing the painful narrative with an empathy that made Margaret feel that her words mattered, that her story had value. There was a moment, during one of these conversations, when Julia held Margaret's hand and said something the elderly woman would never forget. She said that she was not invisible, that her life had meaning, that what had happened to her was an injustice but not an end. She said the non-profit would help her find a path, a structured shelter, maybe even a reintegration program. She also said that Margaret was strong, stronger than she imagined, and that this strength would be the fuel to rebuild her life. Margaret cried that day, but they were different tears from the ones she had shed on the sidewalk in front of the bakery. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of an emotion so intense it couldn't be contained. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward beyond daily survival, beyond misery and humiliation. During her stay at the clinic, Margaret also had the opportunity to take hot showers, something that felt like a luxury after months of cleaning herself in cold public restrooms. The sensation of the hot water falling on her body, washing away not just the physical dirt but also some of the emotional grime that had accumulated, was almost therapeutic. She would stand under the shower until the water turned cold, her eyes closed, letting the steam carry away a little of the pain, a little of the shame, a little of the sadness. The meals were another blessing. Simple food but made with care, rice and beans, a piece of meat or chicken, a salad, a piece of fruit for dessert. Margaret ate slowly, savoring each bite, remembering how good it was to have real food on her plate, not scraps from a trash can or random handouts. Her body, which had become so thin that she startled herself when she saw her reflection, slowly began to regain some weight, some strength. But more important than the physical recovery was the emotional one. There at the clinic, treated with humanity, Margaret began to remember who she was before she became a homeless person. She started to access memories she had tried to bury because they were too painful. The mornings making coffee for John, The afternoons helping Ryan with his homework, the Sundays of carefully prepared chili, the small joys of a simple life full of love. And with these memories came a determination she hadn't felt in a long time, the determination not to give up, not to let herself be completely broken, to find a way out of the hole she had fallen into. Margaret didn't know how she would do it yet. She had no plan, no resources. But she had something she had recovered at that clinic, thanks to the kindness of Julia and everyone who worked there. She had real hope, not just that faint flame that was almost extinguished, but a flame that was beginning to grow again, fueled by the compassion of others and her own resilience that she was discovering within herself. When she was finally discharged, after almost 3 weeks at the clinic, Margaret was much better. The pneumonia was cured, her body was stronger, her mind clearer. Julia helped her organize her belongings in her bags, made sure she had all the medication she needed, and then gave her the news that would change everything. She had secured a spot for Margaret in a city shelter, a structured place, with rules but also with dignity, where she could stay until she found something better. Margaret hugged Julia tightly, feeling the tears well up but holding them back because she wanted to be strong, wanted to show her gratitude, not with tears, but with the determination to seize the chance she was being given. Julia returned the hug, whispered words of encouragement, and promised she would continue to follow her case, that she wasn't just abandoning her now that the acute phase was over. In the car on the way to the shelter, Margaret looked out the window at the streets of New York that had been her hell for so many months, but now she looked at them with different eyes. They were no longer the streets that had swallowed her up and spit her out, no longer the backdrop of her humiliation and invisibility. They were just streets, part of the complex and contradictory city where small miracles happened, where an anonymous old woman offered bread rolls, where a young stranger decided to stop and help, where institutions fought to make a difference even with limited resources. Margaret Miller didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she could truly rebuild her life, if she would find a way back to full dignity, if she would ever again have a home she could call her own. But she knew, with a certainty she hadn't had in a long time, that she was no longer completely alone. And that certainty, however small, was enough to keep going, to face whatever came next, to continue being who she had always been deep down, a survivor, a fighter, a woman who didn't give up even when everything conspired for her to do so. During her days at the clinic, there were moments of deep introspection that Margaret wasn't allowed to have on the streets. On the streets, every second was dedicated to immediate survival. There was no luxury of thinking about the meaning of things, about who she was or who she wanted to be. But there, with her body resting in a clean bed, with guaranteed meals, with people caring for her, her mind finally had the space to process everything that had happened. There were nights when Margaret lay awake late, staring at the clinic ceiling, mentally reliving every moment that had led her there. She thought about the stroke that changed everything. That day she fell at her employer's house and woke up in the hospital, with half her body not responding properly. She thought about the succession of losses that followed, the jobs, the money, the house, and finally her son. She thought especially of Ryan, trying to understand how a boy she had raised with so much love could have become a man capable of abandoning his own mother. Julia, sensing that Margaret was battling internal demons, would sit beside her during these difficult nights and listen. She would simply listen, without trying to fix things, without offering easy solutions, without saying empty platitudes. And in that space of genuine listening, Margaret found the courage to speak of things she had never verbalized before. She told Julia about the guilt she felt, guilt for having been an imperfect mother, for not having given Ryan everything he deserved as a child, for having had to work so much that she sometimes came home too exhausted to play with him. She told her about the times she had been too harsh, when the frustration of her difficult life overflowed into sharp words she later regretted. She told her how she wondered if everything that had happened wasn't, in some way, a consequence of her own mistakes. Julia listened to all of this and then, with the wisdom of someone who had heard many stories of pain, said something that changed Margaret's perspective. She said that to be human was to be imperfect, that all parents make mistakes, that the love she had given her son was real and deep, even if it wasn't perfect. She also said that Ryan's choices were his, not hers, that an adult child is responsible for his own actions, for his own humanity or lack thereof. These nightly conversations became a kind of informal therapy. Margaret began to see her story, not just as a succession of tragedies, but also as a journey of resistance. She began to recognize her own strength in having survived so many months on the streets, in not having given up when it would have been easier to just let go. She began to understand that asking for help was not weakness, that accepting the kindness of others was not shameful, that rebuilding herself after being broken was, in fact, an immense act of courage. The clinic also provided Margaret with something she hadn't expected: connections with other people in similar situations. There was another woman staying there, a lady named Connie, who was also recovering after weeks on the streets. Connie had a different but equally painful story. She had lost her husband, then her house in a fire, then everything else. The two would talk during meals, share stories, cry together, and laugh together at little things that only someone who has lived through the hell of the streets can find funny. Connie had a sense of humor that Margaret admired. Even after everything, she could still make jokes, find the dark comedy in terrible situations. She said humor was her way of not going crazy, of keeping a piece of her humanity intact when everything around her tried to rip it away. Margaret learned from her that it was possible to suffer without completely losing joy, that it was possible to be at rock bottom and still find reasons to smile, even if they were small, brief smiles, stained with tears. When the day came for Connie to be discharged before her, the two embraced for a long time. Connie was going to a different shelter in the Bronx, so they probably wouldn't see each other again. But that brief encounter had meant so much. It had proven to Margaret that solidarity wasn't just a pretty word, that there was a sisterhood among the suffering, a mutual understanding that needed no explanation. The days at the clinic also brought small pleasures that Margaret had forgotten existed. The nurse, a kind woman named Rosa, would sometimes bring homemade cookies her mother made. They were simple sugar cookies, but to Margaret they tasted like the finest of banquets. Dr. Peterson, on his daily rounds, always had a word of encouragement, always asked not just about her physical symptoms, but also about how she was feeling emotionally. There was one particular afternoon that remained etched in Margaret's memory. Julia arrived with a small box of cheap chocolates she had bought at the store. She said it was to celebrate Margaret's progress, that the pneumonia was almost cured, that she would soon be discharged. The two sat on a bench in the clinic's small garden, a little space with a few plants and a tree, and ate the chocolates slowly, savoring not just the sweetness, but the moment of peace, of friendship, of shared humanity. It was that afternoon that Margaret asked Julia why she did it, why she dedicated her time to helping the homeless when she could be doing 1,000 other things with her life. Julia was silent for a moment, looking at the sky where a few white clouds drifted slowly. Then she told her that when she was 15, her father had lost his job and the family was almost evicted. They lived on the edge for months, not knowing if they would have food the next day, if they could pay the rent, if they would end up on the streets. A neighbor, a simple man who also didn't have much, helped them. He brought groceries, talked to the landlord to extend the deadline, and even offered a temporary job to Julia's father in a small business he owned. That gesture saved the family, and Julia grew up carrying that lesson, that a single person doing something can change an entire life, that kindness has a ripple effect that goes far beyond the initial act. Margaret listened to that story with tears in her eyes. She understood that Julia didn't see her as a charity case, as someone inferior who needed to be saved. She saw her as a human being who deserved dignity, who deserved a chance, who deserved to be seen. And that realization was liberating. Margaret didn't have to carry the shame of needing help. Help was not a sign of weakness. It was simply part of being human, of living in a society, of understanding that all of us at some point need each other. In the last few days before her discharge, Margaret began to think about the future more concretely. The shelter she was going to was not the end of the line, but a new beginning. Julia explained that there she would have structure. She would have social workers who would help her get her documents, Apply for assistance programs, maybe even vocational courses. There would be rules too, schedules, responsibilities, but all of that was good. It was structure. It was routine. It was the possibility of rebuilding a life with purpose. Margaret started making small plans. She wanted to learn some crafts, maybe sell them at markets, save some money. She wanted to get her documents back, which had been lost during her months on the streets. She wanted eventually to have her own little room again, nothing big or fancy, but hers, a place where she could close the door and know that no one would kick her out. They were modest dreams, but they were real dreams, not just impossible fantasies. And there was another thought that visited her frequently, a thought she still didn't know how to deal with. What to do about Ryan. Part of her wanted to never see him again, never speak to him again, to simply move on as if he didn't exist, just as he had pretended she didn't exist. But another part, the part that was still a mother despite everything, wondered if she should reach out to him, if she should give him a chance to explain, to apologize, to perhaps start over. Julia, when Margaret shared these doubts, didn't offer easy answers. She just said that Margaret would have to listen to her own heart, that there was no right or wrong answer, that everyone deals with abandonment and betrayal in different ways. She also said that Margaret shouldn't rush, that she had time to decide, that she should focus first on herself, on her own recovery and reconstruction. On the morning she finally left the clinic, Margaret felt a mix of anxiety and hope. Anxiety because she was leaving a safe place where she had been cared for, where she had felt protected. Hope because she was taking a step towards something new, something different, something that could be the beginning of a better life. Julia walked her to the car, carried her bags, made sure she had everything she needed. Before they got in the car, Julia hugged Margaret one more time and whispered something in her ear that would echo in the days to come. She said that Margaret was stronger than she imagined, that she had survived hell and come out the other side with her humanity intact, still capable of loving, of trusting, of dreaming. She also said that this strength would be the foundation upon which Margaret would rebuild her life, brick by brick, day by day, until one day she would look back and be surprised at how far she had come. Margaret got into the car with a heavy heart, but with a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just hope, but also a renewed determination. She had been broken, that was true. She had fallen low she almost couldn't get back up. But she was coming back. She was getting up. And this time, when she stood up completely, it would be with the wisdom of someone who had known rock bottom, with the compassion of someone who had been helped when she needed it most, and with the determination to be for others what Julia and that anonymous woman with the bread rolls had been for her. A light in the darkness, an outstretched hand, proof that kindness still exists in the world. 3 days had passed since Robert's first visit. 3 days that felt like 3 years to Helen, each hour dragging like molten lead. During that time she observed, she learned, she planned, and most importantly she gained unlikely allies. Joanna, the 28-year-old nurse's aide who treated patients with true compassion, had been moved by Helen's story. She saw in the elderly woman's eyes not the confusion of dementia, but the clarity of someone perfectly lucid being wronged. And that bothered her deeply. Joanna had entered this profession to care, to help, not to be an accomplice to unjust confinements. It was on a rainy afternoon, while helping Helen with her shower, that Joanna whispered, "You really shouldn't be here, should you? I see how you talk, how you reason. There's nothing wrong with you." Helen looked at the young woman, assessing if she could trust her. She decided to take the risk. "I shouldn't. My daughter-in-law brought me here to get me out of the way, but I can't prove it if I'm trapped in here." Joanna bit her lip, clearly torn between the fear of losing her job and the voice of her conscience screaming inside her. "I could lose my job if I helped you, but I also can't sleep knowing I'm a part of this." "I'm not asking you to do anything that could harm you," Helen said gently. "I just need to make a phone call, a single phone call." Joanna hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Tomorrow night, after 10, when Dr. Miller leaves and only the night staff is here. I'll leave my cell phone on the desk at the nurse's station. You have 3 minutes, no more." Meanwhile, outside the clinic walls, Robert was going through his own internal storm. Something didn't add up, as much as he tried to accept Jessica's version as much. As he wanted to believe his wife was just looking out for his mother, there were questions that wouldn't go away. He was in his office, on the top floor of a commercial building on Michigan Avenue, when he decided to do something he had never done before. Call the clinic without telling Jessica, speak directly with the doctors, and understand his mother's real condition. Hopewell Meadows Clinic, a female voice answered. Good morning. This is Robert Peterson, son of the patient Helen Peterson. I'd like to speak with the doctor in charge of her case. One moment, please. He waited for almost 5 minutes, listening to an irritating instrumental tune until a male voice came on the line. Mr. Peterson, this is Dr. August Miller. How can I help you? Doctor, I'd like to better understand my mother's condition. What tests have been done? What is the exact diagnosis? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Peterson, didn't your wife inform you? We've done an initial clinical evaluation. As for more in-depth tests, we were waiting for your authorization to proceed. Robert frowned. What kind of tests? A CT scan? An MRI? A full neurological workup, to be certain of the initial dementia diagnosis we suspect. Suspect? So you're not sure? Another silence. Mr. Peterson, your mother exhibited erratic behavior as reported by the family. Based on that and the initial evaluation, we recommended admission as a precaution. But she passed all the cognitive tests you gave her, didn't she? Another pause, this one longer. Yes, she did. But that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't an early-stage condition developing. Robert hung up the phone with a strange feeling in his stomach. Something was definitely not right. His mother had passed all the tests, was lucid, and yet she was locked in a clinic based solely on Jessica's report. A report of an episode that no one but Jessica had witnessed. He decided to do one more thing. He called Maria, the housekeeper who had worked at their home for 15 years. If something strange was going on, Maria would know. Maria, I need to ask you a few questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, Mr. Robert. You know I always have been. Was my mother really confused before she was admitted? Did you see any strange episodes? Maria hesitated. Mr. Robert, Mrs. Helen was always very lucid when I was around. I never saw her confused. But Mrs. Jessica sent me home for a few days off last week, said she was going to take care of everything herself. When I came back, Mrs. Helen had already been taken to the clinic. Robert felt a chill run down his spine. Jessica had sent the housekeeper away on the exact days she claimed Helen was having severe episodes. There were no witnesses, only her word. He spent the rest of the day restless, unable to concentrate on work. When he got home that night, Jessica was in the living room watching television, a glass of wine in her hand, perfectly relaxed. We need to talk, he said without preamble. Jessica turned off the TV. Of course, honey. What is it? I called the clinic today. I spoke with Dr. Miller. He saw a subtle shift in Jessica's expression, so quick he almost missed it. Oh? And what did he say? He said my mother passed all the cognitive tests, that there's no confirmed diagnosis of anything, that she's there only as a precaution based on your report. Jessica placed her wine glass on the table, her hands perfectly steady. That's exactly why she needs to be under observation, Robert, so they can be sure. Better safe than sorry. You sent Maria away on the days you said my mother was confused. I sent her away because I wanted to take care of her personally. I thought it would be better that way. Or because you didn't want any witnesses. The words came out before Robert could stop them. Jessica stared at him, and for a brief second, he saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. Something cold, calculating. But it vanished so quickly he almost thought he'd imagined it. What exactly are you accusing me of? Her voice was low, dangerous. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just trying to understand what really happened. What happened is that your mother is sick and you're in denial. Jessica stood up. I'm trying to help, Robert. I'm taking care of your mother while you're too busy with work to notice what's happening right under your nose. And now you're questioning me as if I'm the villain in this story? Robert had no answer. Part of him knew Jessica was turning the tables, making him feel guilty. But another part, the one used to trusting her, wavered. "I'm going to visit her tomorrow," he said finally. "Alone." Jessica didn't reply. She just picked up her wine glass and left the room, leaving Robert alone with his confused thoughts and a growing sense that he was being deceived, but without knowing exactly how or why. That same night, at exactly 10:15, Helen left her room wearing the hospital gown and rubber slippers that squeaked on the floor. Her heart was beating so hard, she was sure everyone in the clinic could hear it. She walked through the dimly lit corridors to the nurses' station. Joanna was there, pretending to organize charts, but she gave a discreet nod. On the desk, partially hidden under a pile of papers, was the cell phone. Helen picked it up with trembling hands and hurried back to her room. She closed the door and sat on the bed. She had only 3 minutes. She had to use every second wisely. She dialed the number she had memorized decades ago and had never forgotten. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. It was answered. On the 4th ring. "Davis and Associates, good evening. I need to speak with Michael Davis. It's urgent. Tell him it's Helen Peterson. 1 moment, please." A few more seconds of waiting that felt like an eternity. Then a male voice, older but still firm. "Helen, is that really you?" "Michael?" Helen felt her eyes fill with tears upon hearing the voice of her late husband's old friend. "I need your help. I'm in a terrible situation." Quickly, in a low but clear voice, she told him everything. Jessica's manipulation, the forced admission, the attempt to have her declared incompetent. Michael listened in silence, asking only pointed questions. "Where are you exactly?" "Hopewell Meadows Clinic in Lincoln Square." "I know the place. I've handled 2 cases of wrongful commitment from there. Helen, are you still capable of making your own decisions?" "Completely capable. I'm lucid, Michael. You have to believe me." "I believe you. I'll file for a writ of habeas corpus first thing tomorrow morning. But I need you to hang in there for another day or 2 until we get the court order. I don't know if I have that much time. I'm afraid of what Jessica might do." "I'll do it as fast as I can. And Helen, don't sign anything. Don't accept any strong medication they might try to give you. Stay lucid and alert." "I'll try. And I'll call Robert tomorrow. He needs to know the truth." "Thank you, Michael, from the bottom of my heart." She returned the phone to the nurse's station, thanking Joanna with a look. Back in her room, she lay on the bed with her heart still racing, but for the first time since she had been brought to this place, she felt a glimmer of hope. Help was the way. She just needed to hold on a little longer. The next morning, Robert was in a meeting when his secretary interrupted him. "Mr. Peterson, there's a Michael Davis on the line. He says it's urgent and about your mother." Robert took the call immediately. "Hello?" "Robert, my name is Michael Davis. I was your father's lawyer and a good friend. I'm calling because your mother contacted me." "My mother is in a clinic." "I know, and she shouldn't be." "Robert, I need you to listen to me carefully. Your mother is the victim of a wrongful commitment, possibly, for the purpose of misappropriating her assets. I'm filing for habeas corpus today." Robert felt the floor disappear from under him. "What do you mean, misappropriating assets?" "Your mother believes your wife is trying to get her out of the way to gain access to something. It could be inheritance, property, or influence over you. I need to investigate. But what I know is that Helen Peterson, the woman I've known for 40 years, is perfectly lucid, and there is no legal reason for her to be locked in a psychiatric clinic." Robert closed his eyes. It was all starting to make sense. The pieces were fitting together. Jessica had always shown an interest in the house where Helen lived, a valuable property in the Loop. She had always made comments about how that house could be sold, the money better invested, and Helen had always flatly refused. "Where are you now?" Michael asked. "In my office." "Can I come by in an hour? We need to talk in person." "Yes, come." When Michael arrived, Robert saw a man in his 70s with completely white hair, but an upright posture and the sharp gaze of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. They sat in the conference room and Michael opened his briefcase. "Your mother called me last night from inside the clinic. She managed to borrow a phone. She told me everything that happened. Robert, she is lucid, completely lucid, and she is terrified." Robert ran his hands over his face. I wanted to believe Jessica. I wanted to believe she was just taking care of my mother. But the more I look into it, the more things don't add up. Michael took out some documents. I've pulled the commitment file. It's irregular. The medical report is vague, based only on third-party accounts without confirmatory tests. The lawyer who signed the paperwork is known for handling dubious cases, and the clinic has been cited 3 times for irregularities. What do I do? First, you go there now and demand your mother's discharge. You're her son, you have that right. If they refuse, we'll have more proof of wrongdoing. Second, start investigating Jessica. See if she's tried to move assets in Helen's name, if she's forged signatures, if she's created any irregular power of attorney, and if she really was trying to steal from my mother. Then she will pay for it, criminally and civilly. Robert stood up. I'm going to the clinic now. I'm going with you, and this time your mother is walking out of there, even if I have to call the police. They arrived at Hopewell Meadows Clinic half an hour later. Dr. Miller received them with his usual professional and distant air, but Robert noticed a flicker of nervousness when he saw Michael by his side. Dr. Miller, I'm here to get my mother. I want her discharged immediately. The doctor blinked, surprised. Mr. Peterson, it doesn't work like that. Your mother is undergoing treatment. She needs to complete the protocol. Michael stepped forward. Doctor, I am the Peterson family's attorney. If you do not discharge her immediately, I will personally file an injunction within the next 2 hours and ensure this clinic is investigated for every wrongful commitment in the last 5 years, and I can promise you, we will find plenty. Dr. Miller turned pale. I'll get the discharge papers. While they waited, Robert went to his mother's room. He knocked and entered. Helen was sitting on the bed looking out the window, and when she saw her son, her entire face lit up. Robert, you believed me. He went to her and hugged her, feeling how frail she was, how much weight she had lost in those few days, how much she had suffered. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner. I'm sorry I let this happen. Helen cried, but they were tears of relief. You're here now. That's what matters. Half an hour later, Helen was signing the discharge papers against medical advice, wearing her own clothes that Robert had brought, and walking out the main door of the clinic beside her son and Michael. The sun was shining, one of those rare Chicago winter days where the sky is completely blue, and Helen took a deep breath of the fresh air, feeling it fill her lungs as if for the first time. In the car, Michael explained the next steps. We're going to gather all the evidence against Jessica. We'll make sure she never comes near you again, and we'll reverse any documents she may have forged. And my son? Helen looked at Robert. What will happen with you and Jessica? Robert gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. That's over, Mom. My marriage to her is over. I don't know how I didn't see who she really was before. Helen placed a hand on her son's shoulder. You trusted her. There's no crime in trusting. The crime was hers in betraying that trust. Robert took his mother to his own home, set her up in the guest room, and then faced what he knew was coming. The final confrontation with Jessica. She was home when he arrived, as always, perfectly composed, perfectly calm. She saw the expression on his face and knew immediately. You went and got her, she said. It wasn't a question. I did. And I found out everything, Jessica, everything. She didn't deny it. She didn't try to explain. She just smiled, and it was a cold, empty smile. You were never going to let her go. She would always be more important. She would always have more of a say than me. So that was it? You tried to push my own mother away because you were jealous? It wasn't just jealousy, Robert. It was her house, her assets, her influence over you. I deserved more. I deserved all of it. Robert looked at the woman he had been married to for 4 years and didn't recognize her. I want you out now. Jessica picked up her purse, but before she left, she turned one last time. You'll regret this. Your mother will die one day, Robert, and you'll be alone. And you'll remember that you had someone who loved you and you threw it away. You never loved me, Robert said. You loved what I could give you. And she left, leaving only the echo of her heels and the scent of her expensive perfume in the air. That night, Helen and Robert sat down at the dinner table. For the first time in years, just the two of them. Helen had made a simple beef stroganoff, Robert's favorite dish as a child. The smell coming from the kitchen brought back memories of a simpler time, when they lived in that small house in Wicker Park, and all they had was each other. They talked about everything that had happened, about mistakes and forgiveness, about new beginnings. Robert told her how Jessica had changed gradually, so slowly that he hadn't noticed. How she had started with small comments about Helen, planting doubts, creating distance. How she had isolated him, not just from his mother, but from old friends, from anyone who might question the narratives she constructed. "I feel like an idiot," he said, his voice thick with guilt. "I let this happen. I let her manipulate me. I let you suffer." Helen held her son's hand across the table. "You trusted. You loved. There's no shame in that, my son. The shame is hers, for using that love as a weapon. But I should have seen it. I should have listened to you when you started complaining about her. She was very good at what she did, Jessica. Wasn't an amateur manipulator. She was a professional, calculating. She knew exactly what to do, what to say, when to back off, when to push forward." Robert nodded, but Helen could see it would take time for him to fully forgive himself. And maybe that was a good thing. Maybe he needed to carry that weight for a while, to learn, to not make the same mistakes again. The following days were about rebuilding. Michael began a full investigation into Jessica, and what he found was shocking. She had attempted to forge Helen's signature on documents to transfer the house in the loop to Robert's name, which would have given her rights to half of it in a divorce. She had opened a joint account with Robert and transferred significant amounts of money, claiming investments that never existed. She had even tried to convince Robert himself to take out a large life insurance policy on Helen, with him as the beneficiary, which raised serious red flags. She was building a complete scheme, Michael explained in a tense meeting at his office. If she had succeeded in having her declared incompetent, Helen would have lost control of all her assets. Robert would have been appointed her guardian, and Jessica, as Robert's wife, would have had total influence over those decisions. It was brilliant in a disturbing way. "Can we sue her?" Robert asked. "We can and we will. Forgery, attempted embezzlement, wrongful commitment. She will answer for everything." The lawsuit was filed. Jessica hired expensive lawyers and tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that she had only the best intentions, that she loved the family. But the evidence was too solid. The forged documents, the witnesses from the clinic that Michael managed to get to talk, the suspicious bank transactions. It took 6 months for the case to go to trial. Jessica was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a sentence to be served in a minimum security facility given her lack of a prior record. She was also ordered to pay heavy damages to both Helen and Robert, and to return all the embezzled funds. When the sentence was read, Helen was in the courtroom. She looked at Jessica, who was crying theatrically, and felt no anger, no triumph. She felt only a deep sadness for this woman who had so much, who could have built a real life, but chose the path of lies and manipulation. Outside the courthouse, as they walked down the steps under the hot February sun, Robert asked, "How are you feeling, Mum?" Helen thought before answering. "Relieved, exhausted, and strangely grateful." "Grateful?" "Grateful because this brought you back to me. Grateful because I learned I'm stronger than I thought. Grateful because, even in the darkest moments, I found good people like Joanna and Adam and Michael who helped me. And you know, my son, sometimes we have to walk through the darkest valley to truly appreciate the light." Robert hugged his mother right, there in the middle of the courthouse steps as people hurried past them. And Helen knew that despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the betrayal, they were going to be okay, because they had each other. And in the end, that was what really mattered. But Helen's story wouldn't end there, because her experience at Hopewell Meadows Clinic, as painful as it had been, had opened her eyes to a reality she could no longer ignore. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of elderly people being held in places like that unjustly. without a voice, without a defense, forgotten by families who no longer wanted them, or manipulated by self-serving individuals. It was on a March afternoon, having coffee at Michael's house with him and his wife Beatrice, that Helen shared an idea that had been taking shape in her mind. "I want to do something," she said. "I want to help other seniors who are going through what I went through, who don't have a son who wakes up in time, who don't have a lawyer friend willing to fight." Michael leaned forward, interested. "What are you thinking?" Helen took a deep breath. "I want to start a non-profit, an organization that defends the rights of the elderly, that investigates reports of wrongful commitment, that provides free legal aid, that visits nursing homes and clinics to ensure rights are being respected." Beatrice, who was a retired social worker, smiled. "Helen, that's wonderful, and I want to help." Robert, when he heard the idea, not only supported it, but decided to fully fund the initial project. "This is my way of making amends," he said. "Not just for you, but for all the seniors who suffer what you suffered." Within 6 months, the non-profit Silver Dignity was registered and operational. Helen, at 73, found a purpose she had never imagined having. She visited nursing homes, talked to seniors, listened to their stories, identified cases of abuse or neglect. She had a team of volunteer lawyers, social workers, and psychologists. Michael was the legal director, Beatrice the social services coordinator, and Joanna, the nurse's aide who had helped her at the clinic, quit her job and joined the team as the visitation coordinator. Adam, the man she had met at the clinic who had also managed to get out thanks to Michael's intervention, became the organization's treasurer. Together, they formed an unlikely but extremely effective team of people who had suffered and were now turning that pain into purpose. In its first year, Silver Dignity managed to free 18 seniors from wrongful commitments. It reported 3 clinics that were operating illegally. It provided legal assistance to 47 families. It created support groups where seniors could talk about loneliness, abandonment, and fear of the future. Helen became well known in the city. She was interviewed by newspapers, appeared on television telling her story and inspiring others to report abuse. She received awards from human rights organizations. But what made her proudest wasn't the awards or the recognition. It was the face of each senior she helped save, each recovered smile, each voice that was heard again. One afternoon, almost 2 years after it all began, Helen was in the non-profit's office when she received an unexpected visitor. It was a young woman, about 30, who entered shyly and asked to speak with her. "My name is Andrea," the woman said. "I'm Jessica's daughter." Helen felt her heart tighten. She didn't know Jessica had children. "I do. I'm from a previous relationship before she met Robert." Andrea took a deep breath. "I came here because I need to apologize, not for what my mother did, because only she can apologize for that, but for not being there to stop it. I knew what she was like. I knew she was capable of doing terrible things to get what she wanted. But I cut her out of my life years ago and lost track of what she was doing." Helen gestured for her to sit. "You are not to blame for your mother's choices. I know, but I still needed to come here and say that. And also to say that what you're doing, this non-profit, this fight, it's beautiful. My grandmother was put in a nursing home against her will when I was a child. My mother did it because my grandma didn't get along with her stepfather. I still remember my grandma crying when we visited her for the last time. She stayed there for years until her heart couldn't take it anymore." Andrea wiped away tears. "If something like this non-profit had existed back then, maybe my grandma would have had a chance." Helen stood up and hugged the young woman. "You can honor your grandmother by helping others now. Would you like to volunteer?" Andrea nodded, crying, "I would, very much." And so, even from the tragedy with Jessica, something good emerged. Andrea became one of the most dedicated volunteers, carrying her grandmother's story as motivation to ensure others didn't go through the same thing. In the non-profit's 3rd year, Helen was giving a lecture at a university when a law student raised his hand and asked, "Mrs. Peterson, after everything you've been through, how did you not become bitter? How can you still trust people?" Helen thought for a moment before answering. "I could have become bitter. Could have closed my heart and decided that the world is cruel and people are bad. But you know what I learned? I learned that for every one Jessica in the world, there are 10 Joannas, 10 Michaels, 10 Beatrices. Good people who help because it's the right thing to do, not because they expect something in return. If I had focused only on the evil of one person, I would have missed the goodness of so many others. And that would have been the real tragedy. The room erupted in applause, and Helen saw in the eyes of those young people a flame of hope, a desire to make a difference, and she knew her work was just beginning. That night, as Robert drove her home, he asked, "Are you happy, Mum?" Helen looked out the car window, watching the lights of Chicago flicker in the cold winter night. "I am, my son. Happier than I ever imagined I would be at 75. I'm happy because I have a purpose. I'm happy because I'm making a difference. I'm happy because I have you back. And I'm happy because I turned the worst thing that ever happened to me into the best thing I could have ever done." Robert smiled, and Helen saw in him traces of the boy he had been, that boy she had raised with so much love and sacrifice, and she understood that in the end all the pain had been worth it, because it had brought them here, to this moment, to this new beginning. And as the car cut through the city streets, Helen made a silent promise to herself. As long as she had strength, as long as she had a voice, as long as she had life, she would fight for those who could not fight for themselves. She would be the voice for the voiceless, the strength for the weak, the hope for the desperate, because she knew, better than anyone, what it was like to be in that dark place. And she also knew how a single outstretched hand could make all the difference between giving up and carrying on, between being forgotten and being remembered, between dying and truly living. 5 years had passed since that terrible day Helen was locked away in Hopewell Meadows Clinic. 5 years that had completely transformed her life and the lives of so many others. Silver Dignity now occupied an entire building on the Gold Coast, donated by a businessman moved by Helen's story. It had 43 employees, 200 volunteers, and served seniors throughout Illinois. Helen, at 78, still arrived at the office every morning at 9. Her hair was completely white now, but her eyes held the same flame of determination that had kept her alive in the darkest moments. She walked more slowly, sometimes needing a cane on intensely cold days, but her mind was as sharp as ever, and her voice, when she spoke in defense of the elderly, still resonated with power in any room. It was a sunny, windy Thursday in September, and Helen was in her office reviewing a new case when Joanna rushed in. "Helen, we have an emergency. A report just came in from a clinic in Evanston. A daughter is trying to commit her 85-year-old father against his will. The man is completely lucid, he even runs a small grocery store by himself, but the daughter wants to sell the property, and to do that, she needs him declared incompetent." Helen stood up immediately. "Get Michael and Beatrice, we're going there now." Half an hour later, they arrived at the clinic, a modern building, but Helen had learned to recognize the signs of irregularity. Michael, now 76, but still as sharp as a razor in court, went in first, holding a preventative injunction he had hastily obtained from a friendly judge. "We're here for Mr. Albert Morris," he announced to the receptionist. "We're from the Silver Dignity non-profit, and we have a court order to verify the conditions of his admission." The receptionist paled and called the clinic director, a woman in her 50s who tried to be friendly but was visibly nervous. "Mr. Morris is undergoing a medical evaluation," she said. "You can't see him right now." Michael showed her the order. "Either we see him now, or I call the police and a news crew. Your choice." They were led to a room on the second floor. There sat an elderly man with white hair still in his street clothes, looking out the window with an expression of absolute desolation. When he saw Helen enter, his eyes filled with hope. "Are you Mrs. Helen, the one from TV?" "I am, Mr. Morris, and I'm here to get you out." Tears streamed down the man's wrinkled face. "My daughter brought me here saying it was just a checkup, but when we arrived there were papers, a doctor, everything was already set up. She wants my grocery store, wants to sell it to pay off her husband's debts. But that store is all I have, it's my life. I wake up every day at 5 in the morning to open it. I know every customer by name. I'm not crazy. I'm not sick. I'm just old." Helen held his hand. Being old is not a crime, Mr. Morris, and you're walking out. Have here with me today, I promise you that. And he did. Michael used the court order, secured his immediate release, and also filed a lawsuit against the clinic and the daughter for attempted wrongful commitment and embezzlement. Mr. Morris was back in his grocery store that same day, and Helen arranged for one of the non-profit's lawyers to handle his case until they could ensure his daughter could no longer threaten him. This was the daily work. One case after another. One life saved after another. And every time Helen saw a senior's face light up with the realization that they weren't alone, that someone was fighting for them, she felt it was all worth it. That evening when she got home, Robert was already there making dinner. He had made significant changes in his life too. He had cut his workload in half, delegated more responsibilities at his company, and now spent at least 3 afternoons a week volunteering at the non-profit, using his business expertise to optimize processes and raise funds. His relationship with his mother was closer than it had ever been. They had dinner together almost every night. They talked about everything. And he never, again, let work or anyone else come between them. Robert never remarried. He said he needed time, needed to get to know himself better, to understand how he had allowed himself to be so blind. He had gone to therapy for 3 years and now said he was at peace with his choices and his mistakes. Jessica had served 2 years in a minimum security prison and was released for good behavior. She had moved to New York and, as far as Helen knew, was working at a small accounting firm under a different name. Her daughter Andrea maintained minimal contact with her, more out of obligation than affection. While they ate, Robert told her about a generous donation they had received to expand the non-profit's work into Wisconsin. Helen listened, proud of the man her son had become, or rather, the man he had returned to being. The good man who had always existed beneath Jessica's toxic influence. After dinner, they were having tea when the doorbell rang. It was Adam and his new wife, Luciana, a retired teacher he had met in one of the non-profit support groups. They brought news. The company Adam had owned with his ex-wife, which she had nearly destroyed, was now recovered and thriving under his management. And there's more, Adam said with a smile. We're donating 10% of the company's annual profits to Silver Dignity. It's our way of giving back. Helen hugged her friend, moved. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. You saved me, Helen. You truly saved me. If it weren't for you and Michael, I'd still be locked in that clinic while my ex destroyed everything I built. Now it's my turn to help others. The evening went on with conversation and laughter, and Helen thought about how strange life was. 5 years ago, she was alone in a clinic room, terrified, hopeless. Now she was surrounded by people she loved, doing work that mattered, living with purpose and dignity. The following week, Helen was invited to receive an honor at the Chicago City Council. It was National Senior Citizens Day, and she was to be awarded the Medal of Community Merit. Robert accompanied her, along with the entire team from the non-profit. When she went on stage to receive the medal, Helen asked to make a brief speech. She looked at the audience filled with aldermen, journalists, representatives from other non-profits, and began to speak. 5 years ago, I was locked in a psychiatric clinic despite having no mental illness. I was there because someone decided I was inconvenient, that my existence interfered with their plans, and I learned in the most painful way possible how easy it is to make a senior citizen disappear in this country. How easy it is to silence them, lock them up, and forget them. The room fell into absolute silence. But I also learned something else. I learned that as long as there is one person willing to fight, hope does not die. And that's why I'm here today. Not to receive medals, but to say that the fight is not over. We need stricter laws, more effective oversight, and more severe punishments for those who abuse the elderly. And more than that, we need a cultural shift. We need to teach the younger generations that growing old is not a shame, that seniors are not burdens, that they are people with stories, with wisdom, with the right to dignity until the very last day of their lives. The applause was deafening, and Helen saw tears on many faces, because everyone there had parents, grandparents, or were themselves approaching their senior years. And they all knew, deep down, that this could happen to anyone. After the ceremony, a young journalist asked for an interview. They sat in a nearby cafe and the reporter turned on her recorder. "Mrs. Peterson, do you forgive Jessica for what she did?" Helen thought carefully before answering. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean saying what she did was acceptable. It means releasing the anger that would poison me if I carried it for too long. So yes, I have forgiven her. But not for her benefit, for my own. And your son, how does he deal with it all? Robert is doing well. It took time. He went to therapy. He faced his own demons. But he's at peace now, and our relationship is stronger than ever. What would you say to other seniors who are experiencing situations of abuse? That you are not alone, that help is available, that it's worth fighting, and that age does not diminish our value as human beings. Helen looked directly at the camera that was recording. If you are a senior being abused, mistreated, or neglected, or if you know someone in that situation, report it. Call Silver Dignity or any other organization that defends the rights of the elderly. Do not accept being treated as disposable. You matter. Your life matters. Your dignity matters. The interview aired on television that night and went viral on social media. The non-profit's phone didn't stop ringing for days. Dozens of reports, hundreds of requests for help, and also, to Helen's joy, hundreds of offers of volunteer time and donations. A month later, Helen was at home on a Saturday afternoon when she felt a sharp pain in her chest. Robert was there, realized immediately that something was wrong, and rushed her to the hospital. On the way, Helen held her son's hand and said, "If it's my time, it's okay. I've lived. I've truly lived. I made a difference. I have no regrets." "Don't talk like that, Mom. You're going to be fine." And she was. It was just an angina attack, a warning from her heart that she needed to slow down a bit. The doctors put her on medication, adjusted her treatment, and recommended more rest. Helen agreed to reduce her workload but flatly refused to retire completely. "As long as I can walk, as long as I can talk, I will keep working," she told Robert stubbornly in the hospital room. He laughed and hugged his mother. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you." 3 months later, on a particularly beautiful spring day, Helen was in her office when Joanna entered with a strange expression. "Helen, there's someone here who wants to speak with you. She says it's personal." "Who is it?" Joanna hesitated. "It's Jessica." Helen felt her heart race, but she took a deep breath and nodded. "You can send her in." Jessica entered the office, a completely different woman from the one Helen had known. She was thinner. Her hair lacked its former shine. Her clothes were simple. There was no makeup, no jewelry, none of the sophistication she used to flaunt. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished. They looked at each other for a long moment before Jessica spoke. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," she said, her voice low, "because I know I don't deserve it. I came because I needed to look at you and tell you that you won. Not just against me, but against everything I represented. You turned the worst thing I did to you into the best thing you could have done. And that destroys me in a way prison never could." Helen gestured for her to sit. "Why did you do it, Jessica?" "Really?" Jessica sat, her hands trembling in her lap. "Because I always believed the world owed me something, that I deserved more than I had. And when I looked at you, I saw someone who had so little but seemed so happy. You had your son's love in a way I never would, and I wanted to destroy that. I wanted you to feel what I felt inside, empty, alone, but all I managed to do was destroy myself. Have you sought help? Therapy?" Jessica nodded. "I've been in treatment for 3 years. I know I have narcissistic personality disorder. I know I'll probably always have to fight against it, but I'm trying to be a better person." "And your daughter?" "Andrea has forgiven me more than I deserved. She's working here with you, isn't she? She tells me. Says you saved her too, somehow. Gave her a purpose I never could." Jessica stood up. "I'm going to go now. I just wanted to tell you that you won, and you deserved to win." After she left, Helen sat alone in her office for a long time, looking out the window at the city she loved so much. She felt no triumph, no anger. She felt only a calm sadness for all that had been wasted, all the potential Jessica had thrown away because of her own inner toxicity. But she also felt gratitude, because from that terrible experience, from that fall into the abyss, she had found her true calling. She had discovered that even at 72, even after thinking her life was already defined and over, there was still time to start again, to reinvent, to make a difference. On the eve of her 79th birthday, the whole family gathered at her house for a celebration. Robert was there, of course, and Michael with Beatrice, Joanna with her fiancé Adam and Luciana, Andrea with her new boyfriend, and dozens of people whose lives Helen had touched in some way. Mr. Morris brought sweets from his grocery store. A 90-year-old woman Helen had helped get out of an abusive nursing home brought an embroidery she had made especially for her. An 83-year-old man who had recovered his assets after Helen exposed his manipulative nephew brought flowers from his own garden. As everyone sang Happy Birthday, Helen looked around the room and felt her heart overflow. Here was the proof that her life had mattered, that she had made a difference, that the pain had not been in vain. When everyone had gone and only she and Robert were left cleaning up, he asked, "Happy, Mum?" Helen smiled. "More than I ever imagined possible. You know, my son, I used to think my life would end quietly, forgotten, but I've learned that it's never too late to be remembered, never too late to fight, never too late to matter." Robert hugged his mother. "You always mattered, Mom. To me, you always mattered." At that moment, Helen's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but she answered as she always did, never knowing when it might be someone needing help. "Hello? Mrs. Helen?" The voice on the other end was a young woman crying. "My name is Patricia. My grandmother is being mistreated in a nursing home here in Joliet. They won't let her have visitors. They say she's confused, but I know she's not. Please, can you help?" Helen grabbed a pen and paper. "Give me the address, I'll be there tomorrow." And she went, as she always did, because this was her purpose now, and every case, every story, every life saved added another brick to the legacy she was building. At the nursing home, Helen found an 86-year-old woman named Antonia, locked in a tiny room, without her glasses, without her dentures, without anything that gave her dignity. Her granddaughter Patricia explained that her siblings had put their grandmother there to divide the inheritance without her being able to question it. Helen entered that room and sat beside Antonia. She held her hand and said, "I know what this is like. I've been where you are, and I'm here to get you out." It took 2 days of legal battles, but Antonia left that nursing home. Michael managed to nullify the attempted division of assets and ensured that Antonia returned to her own home, where Patricia moved in to care for her. It was another victory, another life restored to dignity. The following months were intense. The non-profit was growing exponentially. They opened branches in Peoria and Springfield. They started a training program for caregivers of the elderly, teaching not only physical care techniques, but more importantly, respect and empathy. They created a 24-hour hotline for reporting abuse. Helen was constantly on the move, giving lectures at universities, talking to politicians to propose new laws, visiting nursing homes and clinics. Robert worried about the pace she kept, but Helen said she would rest when there was no more work to do. And as long as there was a single senior being mistreated in America, there would be work. It was on one of those intense days that Helen received a phone call that took her completely by surprise. It was the Department of Health and Human Services from Washington, D.C. They wanted to appoint her to a national commission on the rights of the elderly, which would directly advise the presidency on creating new public policies. Helen, at 79, found herself traveling to D.C. once a month, sitting at tables with secretaries and administrators, presenting proposals based on her real experience in the trenches of this fight. And the most incredible thing was, they listened, they truly listened. Within a year, 3 new laws were passed, thanks in large part to the Commission's work. One that stiffened penalties for elder abuse, another that mandated quarterly inspections of all long-term care facilities for the elderly, and a third that created an integrated national reporting system, making it easier for anyone to report abuse. Helen cried when the third law was signed. Robert was with her in DC that day, and he cried too, because they knew it would change lives, it would save lives. But not everything was a victory. There were cases Helen couldn't resolve in time. There were seniors who passed away before justice could reach them. Those were the hard days, the days when Helen came home exhausted not just physically but emotionally. On one of those nights, after losing a particularly painful case of a man who had suffered for years before they could intervene, Helen sat in the living room with Robert and vented. I try so hard, but I can't save everyone. I can't get there in time for everyone." Robert held his mother's hand. "But you save so many, Mom, and every life you save, every person you help," it echoes. "They will help others who will help others. You've started a wave that won't stop. I hope you're right, because I can't accept a world where seniors are disposable. I just can't. And that's why you don't accept it. That's why you fight. Helen, you are living proof that one person can make a difference." Helen knew her days were numbered, as they are for everyone. Her heart was weak, her knees ached constantly. There were days when the fatigue felt overwhelming. But she wasn't afraid of leaving, because she knew that when her time came she would leave a solid legacy. Sometimes, in the quiet nights, she still thought about those terrible days in the clinic. She still felt the tightness in her chest, the fear, the absolute loneliness, the sound of the door being locked, the feeling of being completely at the mercy of people who saw you only as a problem to be solved. But now she saw it for what it really was, not an end, but the violent beginning of something extraordinary, the beginning of a mission that would outlive her own life. One autumn afternoon, Helen was giving a lecture at a medical school when a student asked, "Mrs. Peterson, how do you maintain hope after seeing so much suffering?" Helen thought carefully before answering. "I maintain hope because I see change. I see laws being passed. I see more people caring. I see young people like you choosing this profession not just for the salary, but for a genuine desire to care. And I see that every person I help has the potential to help others. Hope doesn't come from ignoring suffering. It comes from fighting against it every day and seeing that the fight is not in vain." The students applauded, and Helen saw in many of their eyes a determination that filled her with optimism. The next generation would be better. It had to be. On her 80th birthday, the celebration was even bigger than the year before. The non-profit organized an event at the Chicago Cultural Center, one of the most beautiful places in the city, and more than 500 people attended. Seniors Helen had helped, grateful family members, volunteers, staff, public officials. When it was time for speeches, Robert took the stage and spoke. "My mother has always been an extraordinary woman, but 5 years ago when she was unjustly committed to a psychiatric clinic, I feared it would break her, that it would leave her bitter, afraid, closed off. But she surprised me, as she always does. She transformed that trauma into the greatest work of her life. She turned pain into purpose, and in doing so, she not only saved herself, but she saved hundreds of other people. Mom, you are my hero, and I am grateful every day for the chance to be your son." Helen cried, and there was no shame in her tears. They were tears of gratitude, of fulfillment, of love. When it was her turn to speak, Helen walked to the stage, leaning on her cane but with her head held high. She looked at all those people, all those lives that had somehow intertwined with hers, and began. "When I was 72, I thought my life was essentially over, that everything I had to do was already done. And then something terrible happened. I was betrayed, imprisoned, nearly destroyed. But in that darkest moment, I discovered there was still a fire inside me. There was still a fight. And I discovered my true calling." She paused, emotional. "Every person in this room is a part of this story. Every volunteer who donates their time, every lawyer who takes a case pro bono, every donor who believes in this cause, every senior who had the courage to report the abuse they suffered. You are all co-authors of this miracle we have built together. And to those who are listening and may be going through situations of abuse, of neglect, of disrespect, I say this: fight. Do not accept being invisible. Do not accept being disposable. You matter. Your voice matters. Your life matters. And there are people willing to fight by your side. It is never too late. For dignity. It is never too late for justice. The applause was deafening and prolonged. Helen saw tears on many faces, saw hugs, saw hope. In the following months, Helen began working on an autobiography. Not because she wanted fame, but because Michael had convinced her that her story needed to be documented, recorded for future generations. She sat with a young writer 3 times a week and told her everything. The humble childhood, the marriage, widowhood, the struggle to raise Robert alone, the relationship with Jessica, the forced commitment, the legal battle, the creation of the non-profit. Writing about it all was cathartic in a way Helen hadn't expected. It was like organizing the fragmented pieces of her life into a coherent narrative, a journey with meaning. And in doing so, she understood even more deeply that nothing had been wasted. Every pain, every struggle, every difficult moment had been necessary to bring her to where she was. The book would be released the following year, with all proceeds going to the non-profit, but Helen already knew it wouldn't be just a memoir. It would be a manifesto, a battle cry, a call for society to wake up and stop treating seniors as second-class citizens. It was late on a Friday afternoon, and Helen was in her office organizing papers when Joanna ran in. "Helen, you have to see this. Turn on the news channel." Helen turned on the TV and saw a report about a major fraud scheme against the elderly that had been uncovered. Several psychiatric clinics were being investigated for wrongful commitments coordinated with corrupt lawyers and greedy family members. It was exactly the kind of scheme Jessica had tried to use against her, and the report credited the investigation to tips received by the Nationals, hotline created by the law Helen had helped pass. "It's working," Helen whispered, her eyes welling up. "The system is working." That night, Helen slept better than she had in months, because she saw concrete proof that the work was bearing fruit, that the laws were being enforced, that change was happening. The following Sunday, Helen went to Mass at Old St. Patrick's Church, as she did every Sunday. She sat in her usual pew and prayed, as she always did, for the strength to continue, for the wisdom to make the right decisions, for the compassion to never lose sight of the suffering of others. And she gave thanks. She gave thanks for being alive, for having a purpose, for having the chance to make a difference. When she left the church, an elderly man approached her on the sidewalk. "Mrs. Peterson, I just wanted to thank you. My sister was being mistreated in a nursing home. I called your non-profit, and in 2 days she was out of there. You saved her. You saved us." Helen hugged the man. This was what mattered. Not the medals, not the public recognition, but these moments, these transformed lives. As the year progressed, Helen felt the weight of her age more than ever. There were days when getting out of bed required a heroic effort, days when the pain in her knees was so intense she needed strong painkillers, days when the fatigue seemed absolute. But she continued, because as long as there was work to do, as long as there were lives to save, she would continue. Michael, now 77, and also feeling the weight of age, talked to her one afternoon about succession. "Helen, we need to think about the future of the non-profit. We need to ensure it continues after we're no longer here." Helen knew he was right. Together they began to form a younger board of directors, gradually transferring responsibilities, ensuring the institution did not depend on any one person. Joanna took over as executive director. Adam remained in charge of finances. Andrea, who had graduated from law school, took over legal coordination, and Robert, who had fallen in love with the work, became chairman of the board. On a particularly cold winter night, Helen was at home with Robert when he asked, "Mum, are you afraid of leaving?" Helen looked at her son. "I'm not afraid of leaving itself. I'm afraid of leaving knowing there's still so much to be done. But I also know I did the best I could with the time I had, and I know you all will continue." "We will continue," Robert promised. "I promise, Mom." Helen knew her days were numbered. Her heart was getting weaker. The doctors had been clear. It could be months, it could be weeks. But she wasn't afraid, because she knew that when she left, she would leave a solid legacy. The non-profit would continue. The laws she helped create would continue to protect seniors. The people she saved would continue saving others, and her story, her fight, would continue to inspire. And on one of those nights, as the rain fell softly outside and Chicago slept under a cloudy sky, Helen closed her eyes and made one last promise. As long as she had breath, she would fight. As long as she had a voice, she would speak. As long as she had life, she would matter, because she was Helen. And Helen didn't quit. She never had. And even when she was no longer there physically, her spirit, her fight, her flame, would continue to burn in the hearts of all those she had touched. And that, Helen understood in that moment of absolute clarity, was true immortality, not being remembered, but continuing to make a difference even after you're gone. And with that thought warming her heart, Helen fell asleep in peace, smiling, ready for another day of struggle when the sun rose again. Dear listeners, we hope Helen's story has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of overcoming, dignity, and new beginnings, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you the most in this incredible woman's journey. Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and remind us that no matter the age, no matter how difficult the situation, it is always possible to fight for one's own dignity and turn pain into purpose. Helen's story teaches us that it's never too late to start over, never too late to make a difference, and that true strength lies not in never falling, but in always getting back up. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on courage, resilience, and the true meaning of victory.